Finally, language is a system of communication using vocal sounds, gestures, and written symbols. It's probably the most significant component of culture because it allows us to communicate, and language is how we actually pass culture on. Language is so important that many have argued that it shapes not only our communication, but our perceptions and how we see things as well. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that's the idea that language structures our thought and the ways of looking at the world are embedded in language, and it's based on this premise. For example, if I made up a word right now, told you that the word I just made up is an animal, and then asked you to picture that animal, could you do it? Probably not, since it's made up. But if I said picture a cow, you could probably think of a cow. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis tells us that if we don't have the language or the words to describe something, we can't even think of it. In other words, language shapes our thoughts. Culture includes values and norms. Values are shared beliefs about what a group considers worthwhile or desirable, and they guide the creation of norms. And norms are the rules regarding what kinds of behavior are acceptable and appropriate within a culture. For instance, in the United States, we value our privacy. Therefore, it would be considered a breach of a norm to spy on another person. Some norms are so important to us that we codify them into laws, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Norms are specific to a culture, a time period, and a situation. And they can be either formal, such as a law or the rules for playing soccer, or informal, things that are not written down or are unspoken. Norms about smoking and drug use have changed over time, and they are different in the United States than in other countries. This shows how norms are specific to a culture, a time period, and a situation. Laws are basically norms that were considered so important to our society that they were codified into formal norms. And informal norms include things like not burping in public. It's not against the law, but doing it will generally get you a negative reaction, indicating that you broke an informal norm. Types of norms can be distinguished by the strictness by which they are enforced. If you're in an elevator, you know that there are few acceptable behaviors. You're following norms if you look at the doors or the buttons or stare at the floor. However, if you turn and stare at the person standing beside you, you're likely to make that person feel very uncomfortable. You could tell you violated a norm because that person will step aside, press the door open button, and possibly leave the elevator. If you violate a more important norm, you might make someone gasp or physically react to your action, and you would be able to tell that the norm that you violated was a more important one. This happens very commonly by accident with people who are traveling abroad or even a different region in the United States if they're not familiar with the norms in that specific culture. Folkways are loosely enforced norms that involves common customs, practices, or procedures that ensure smooth social interaction and acceptance. Mores are a norm that carries moral significance. It's closely related to the core values of a group and it often involves severe repercussions for violations. A taboo is a norm ingrained so deeply that even thinking about violating it evokes strong feelings of disgust, horror, or revulsion for most people. Folkways include things like using the correct fork for eating salad, or coming to class prepared, and so on. Mores include things that a society values as significantly as important norms. You could think of word morals to help remind you of this concept. For existence, There are more mores against lying, cheating, and similar acts. A common example of a taboo is incest. Incest is a nearly universal taboo, and the fact that there is little cross-cultural variation in the reaction that indicates that it may have a biological component. How do we enforce norms? We do so through sanctions. Sanctions are positive or negative reactions to the ways that people follow or disobey norms, including rewards for conformity and punishments for norm violators. Sanctions could include providing candy for a child who did well for the day or punishing a child who misbehaved. Behaviorists believe that our actions are based on the desire to get more rewards and to avoid punishments, so that it's possible that using sanctions will provide incentives for people to follow the standards and expected behaviors in society. Sanctions help to establish social control, the formal and informal mechanisms used to increase conformity to values and norms and increase social cohesion. Variations in culture. Multiculturalism values diverse racial, ethnic, national, and linguistic backgrounds and thus encourages the retention of cultural differences within society rather than assimilation. Although much research focuses on the differences between cultures, there's also a tremendous variation within a culture. In the United States, there's a trend that encourages multiculturalism. However, we still often see the dominant culture as the norm, and therefore many minority cultures feel pressure to conform. Dominant culture. The dominant culture refers to the values, norms, and practices of the group within society that is most powerful in terms of wealth, prestige, status, and influence. In the United States, the dominant culture is often referred to as WASP, WASP, for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and the dominant culture also includes males rather than females. The dominant culture varies from society to society. Subcultures. A subculture is a group within society that is differentiated by its distinctive values, norms, and lifestyle. Subcultures tend to exist harmoniously within the larger society. They interact with the dominant group but maintain their distinctive values, norms, and lifestyles. Subcultures include skateboarders, vegetarians, and college students. Countercultures. A counterculture is a group within society that openly rejects and may actively oppose society's values and norms. Countercultures tend to exist separately from the dominant culture in many ways. They generally openly reject society's values, so it would be difficult for them to interact within that culture. Examples include religious extremists and white supremacists. Cultural change. We know that culture is not static, but it's dynamic. It's continually changing. Cultures usually change slowly and incrementally, though change can also happen in rapid and dramatic ways. At times, a subculture can influence the mainstream and become part of dominant culture, or something that is dominant can change to a counterculture. One of the key ways the material culture can change is through technology. Advances like the internet have helped disseminate information and create social movements. Culture is constantly changing, and the norms within society will change as well. For instance, at one point, tattoos were considered appropriate only for servicemen, but now many college students and many others in society have tattoos. The subculture influenced the norms of the dominant culture, and the dominant culture changed. There are a number of ways in which culture changes over time. Cultural diffusion is the spreading of culture across nations. As groups come into contact with one another, things that are found in one culture very often make their way into other cultures. There's discovery. Those are changes that happen when people discover things that are already in existence. Invention is coming up with something brand new. Cultural lag, we know that material culture can change faster than non-material cultures. For example, most of the music that's available these days is available in digital formats for download or streaming, but still very often people refer to music as CDs. Culture clash happens when two groups that strongly disagree on ideas or practices come together and have conflict. And then finally, there are cultural universals. Those are ideas and artifacts that are found in many cultures.